Welcome to Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark, and you just heard Anvil. This is 13.
Yes.
From Canadian Metal Volume 1.
Yes, and from the album, This is 13. It's not episode 13 to confuse you, but the song itself is actually just 13. And we've been bouncing this idea around for quite a while.
6-7 months,
yeah,
at least.
Probably. I think ever since we saw the Anvil documentary, there was a part of us that kind of wanted to, to dig into that a little bit. And then our love of Dark Throne,
Throne
Canadian metal, the song.
Marduk EPs.
Yeah.
What is it, Obedience?
No, the Glorification EP. Yeah. And there's this kind of mystical quality to the Canadian metal scene. And the more we started to piece parts of it together, the more we found that a lot of it was actually pretty quality, and it had a kind of an edge to it that was pretty unique for 80s kind of thrash, heavy metal kind of stuff.
One with bands names like Exciter and Razor. You wouldn't really necessarily have a high expectation what those bands are going to sound like. And
I think I used to get a lot of those bands kind of confused almost with like bad, like, German power metal or something. Like it blended together so much sometimes that I don't think I ever really had any impetus to kind of like want to, jump in and kind of get into it a little. So we decided to kind of look at it from a couple of different angles. And what we're going to be doing this episode is kind of like focusing, I guess, on the 80s thrash metal scene. And we'll talk about...
Even though this is 13's from 2007, but...
Yeah, and we'll talk about that.
Sound exactly the same.
Yeah. We'll kind of get into why we're starting with Anvil and that kind of thing for those of you out there, which would be probably, hopefully, not a lot of you that haven't seen the Anvil documentary yet. But... and then what we're going to do is kind of look at this as, Canadian Metal Volume 1, kind of the background and give you a sprinkling of some of the great kind of thrash bands of the 80s. And some of them are like, almost like proto-death type stuff when we get, near the end of the show. And then this will sort of build to a focus on one particular kind of classic record of Canadian metal of the thrash genre that we won't reveal. You'll have to kind of wait to sort of see what that is.
And actually, it's on the tail end of the thrash genre.
It is. And then what we were going to do as a second set of shows, whether it will be right afterwards or there might be a slight gap, especially with kind of the year-end show coming up around the corner and stuff for those of you that always anticipate our double bonus episode year-end show. And then we were going to kind of look not necessarily away from the thrash scene because some of those bands had associations, but kind of like at the other really, I guess, unique oddity of Canadian metal, which is their sort of tech death, really technical kind of side of things.
Yeah, from Voivod, the Gorguts, the
Cryptopsy, and just a lot of bizarre stuff. I mean, even like the kind of best Canadian metalcore band, The End, was sort of like a Dillinger clone, very technical, mathematical kind
Rush.
of stuff. Yeah, the roots are with Rush and some of that kind of stuff.
Triumph.
So. Yes, I've recently discovered some. I downloaded some Triumph because I heard "Lay It on the Line" on the radio, and I couldn't get it out of my head. So I had no idea they were Canadian, so kind of fits in with the whole thing. But Anvil, the reason we started with "This Is 13" is that was sort of I guess the comeback record. It's the record, if you've seen the documentary, that they're overseas recording near the end of it,
borrowing money from his sister to get recorded, which.
He has paid off.
Yeah, good to know that
he's made enough money off this. Yeah, and they record with and I know I'll butcher his last name, Chris Sangaritis, I think it is, TSA.
He had a pretty illustrious producing career, didn't he?
He had done like a lot of like really kind of slicked up 70s rock and early 80s stuff. He may have had some associations.
I thought he had something to do with Zeppelin.
Could have been. I know, like, I probably should have looked. It just escapes me at the moment. But he recorded their very first albums, which were pretty famous, I guess, in the Canadian metal scene back in the early days. Even
in the American metal scene when they were touring with, Anthrax.
Yeah, Metal on Metal and Forged in Fire. I don't know if he did Forged in Fire, but those are kind of the two first ones. You were joking that you want to memorize all the Anvil album titles in a sequence as if it was a kind of a poetic puzzle of some sort.
Well, it's like Demon Warrior Records. It's three word titles.
And the song "This Is 13," which is kind of like the epic, it has an epic quality to it, and you can kind of hear a lot of the kind of cool elements that Anvil has about them. Whether it's the fact that they do have some kind of thrashy leads to them, but they can also kind of go into like kind of thundering, Sabbathy doom type stuff, and This Is 13 has that like plotting kind of quality to it, that's pretty
amazingly they've almost kept the level of quality consistent throughout their entire career. I mean, as far as the sound, you can't really place when the thing was recorded when you hear it.
I guess the timeless quality to it. I was gonna say, I think I've heard Anvil songs from prior to This Is 13 and after Forged in Fire that were pretty lackluster in terms of the recording quality, And I think one of the things that's cool about this record is how well it does sound, you know, and it's obviously proved to be kind of a comeback record for him. And, you know, the whole premise of the documentary, for those of you that haven't seen it, is, of course, just sort of, you know, following them on tour as they're kind of going through like a real Spinal Tap kind of experience.
Well, they were a band in the early 80s. They were on the cusp of becoming a really popular band, really influential band, and then just basically fell off the map.
Yeah, and you know, they have sort of struggled through, barely, you know, kind of making it and never really getting the credit that they, I guess, deserved, you know. And the two mainstays, I guess, of the band are Lips, the guitar player, and Rob Reiner. Rob with 2 B's, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, not to be confused with the director of Princess Bride and ironically, Spinal Tap. Yeah. And they, you know, from a historical standpoint, you know, as Mark was just saying, you know, they're interesting because they're definitely influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal scene, which you'll hear when we go back to their early records here in a second. But, you know, not only do they kind of lay the foundation of all, I guess, Canadian thrash music, really. I mean, I think everybody kind of borrows a little bits and pieces from what they do, as well as steal from Germany.
Especially vocally, I think, and lyrically to some degree.
Yeah, and Mark can comment on that in a second. But I think one thing we should say is, you know, I really put them in the same category, especially early on, like with a band like Accept, where they're sort of the bridge between kind of thrash, well, new wave of British heavy metal and thrash. You know, they're definitely increasing the velocity, but then they're still taking some of like the twin lead elements of new wave of British heavy metal, but they're kind of dirtying it up a little bit and making a little.
There's much more of a sense of humor about everything as well. I think that's one thing. Well, not all Canadian bands we're going to talk about today, but many of them have a very good sense of humor, or
they're just problems. or they have issues of juvenile.
Arrested Development issues.
Yeah, Arrested Development. They haven't quite evolved, you know. And I don't want to get any Canadian jokes going because we live in Michigan and we're practically Canadian in some sense. And we love our northern neighbors here. That's why we're devoting some shows to them. But there's definitely, you know, a vibe going on for sure that's coming out of that new wave of British heavy metal scene, which you're going to hear on the next tracks that we play, which is from their debut, Metal on Metal. And, you know, this is at a time, as Mark was saying, that they were touring with pretty big bands. You know, this is 82 that the record comes out.
God, what was it, like the Gods of Rock tour?
Yeah, they were
like Kiss, and I mean, and Van Halen. I mean, it was a pretty huge lineup for them to be on, and to be at that height, and then basically just go into obscurity, but yet still have they got like 13 records?
Yeah, something. Well, this is 13.
They're working on their 14th right now.
Yeah, this is 13. It's pretty obvious, you know. Again, the Arrested Development factor of their. I mean, I guess tell us a little bit about the lyrics. You know, I mean, that you've noticed on Anvil records.
I mean, it's using basically any kind of like cliche or witticism or, you know, basically anything you could possibly hear in some kind of like old man telling you a story. They throw it in, but most of these lyrics sound as if they wrote them 5 minutes before they stepped in front of the mic.
My favorite song title, I think, is Heat Sink for sure. It's just it's something like you would snicker about in like 4th grade.
What was the other Thumb something? Thumb Hang.
Thumb Hang. They finally Thumb Hang was like the first Anvil song. It's like
they ever wrote as like 16-year-old kids.
Yeah, it's like the aggressive perfecter.
It was about the Inquisition, wasn't it?
Yeah, they read something. The Grand Inquisitor used to hang them on thumbs, you know, and stuff.
Which they still have that kind of like, you know, that teenage enthusiasm about like reading a history book and then, that sounds cool. There's a song title.
Yeah. Well, and they have their version of their own 666. So, you know. But we're not playing either of those songs, nor are we playing the title track, which is, I guess, an anthem of Canadian metal, but in a cool song, and it's one, if you've seen the movie, you probably know pretty well. But it's fairly repetitive, and it doesn't...
It's so well heard.
Yeah. And I don't even think it's the best song on the record or anything. That's why we wanted to focus on maybe the musical, you know, the songs that I guess represent them in a thrash-based way, more the heavier side of Anvil.
Well, and Rob Reiner, I think, at the time was pretty revolutionary in his approach to drumming as well. Like tons of double bass, but not just purely as kind of like a momentum thing, but really kind of worked it in with the whole overall vibe, and just the way he played was so much different than anyone else.
He's pretty loose, you know, and I don't want to use the word sloppy, but I think it's sloppy loose in a controlled way. Like he's like purposefully kind of not trying to be like super tight, like technical, Lombardo style or something like that.
Yeah.
But he's kind of, you're right, he's hitting some like odd choices and stuff on some of the drums.
Yeah, it's not necessarily jazzy, but it's more like improvisational, I think, than some of the stuff we'll hear a little later on.
Going back to the last episode we did, it's almost like a primitive version of what the guy from the Last Death record does, Richard Christie, a little bit,
yeah.
Not in that kind of level, but the same kind of thought process of how he approaches
Reiner, one of his big influences was like bands like Cactus and Wishbone Ash and more proggy kind of stuff. Yeah. So I can see how that kind of works.
What's that great story in the movie? Like he said he walked by
this guy's wearing Cactus
Lips window, and he's like, we're probably the only, this must be the only other guy that listens to Cactus. I better get to know this guy. It's just kind of funny little stories in the documentary that make me smile when I talk about this band.
How genuine these guys are.
They're sort
sweethearts.
They're living, they're definitely living the dream, and that's what's cool about the documentary. Anybody that's ever tried to make it in any kind of creative avenue can relate to the struggles that they're going through in that movie, and it's just cool to see them kind of come full circle, which is why we wanted to start the show with This Is 13. The two tunes we picked out from Anvil, from Metal on Metal, which is really, we're just going to, like I said, give you samples of some of these great bands. You can kind of go and check them out on your own and delve more into their back catalogs like we did. But we're going to start with Mothra, which is kind of the epic song on the record, along with Metal on Metal, I think. And it's got a really cool like Iron Maiden vibe for sure going on. Some of the vocals especially remind me of Paul Di'Anno in terms of just the sort of raw punk kind of primitiveness of it, and then we're gonna kind of move from that into a pretty sweet instrumental called March of the Crabs, which I couldn't begin to tell you what the reference might be.
I'm guessing it's probably an STD reference.
It could be, or some like really horrible bad sci-fi film.
Just because there's no like common thread of any of these songs. I mean, it goes Metal on Metal, Mothra, Stop Me, Jackhammer, Heat Sink, Tag Team, Tease Me, Please Me. I mean, there's
Tease Me, Please Me sounds like a song from like Girls, Girls, Girls or something, So they're all over the map, and that's one of the things you'll find with the Canadian thrash scene is there's no consistency. They're very unpredictable. Their influences are always very strange. It's like a amalgamation of like weird geographical places, and that's what kind of makes them Canadian in their own sort of way.
Yeah.
But and then we're gonna move from Anvil into a band called Exciter, and we'll just kind of introduce them a little bit, and then we'll talk more about them and Razor when we come back. But Exciter kind of burst out the year after Metal on Metal in 1983 with the debut record
Heavy Metal Maniac,
yeah. And definitely a German vibe to them,
a heavy Metallica vibe as well.
Yeah, and kind of a mix, and they're going to be one of the bigger Canadian bands for sure, because they'll actually get picked up by Megaforce Records, which is where Metallica and Anthrax and Testament kind of get their start. Wait. Did Anthrax? Yeah, Anthrax originally was on Megaforce before they went to Ireland.
I think so.
Yeah. Sorry, I may have. And speaking of Anthrax, I really detect kind of a belladonna vocal kind of pattern, minus the really high notes, He's almost got like the monotone part of belladonna down.
It's almost amalgam of like every major thrash vocalist of the time kind of wrapped together, and I don't think it's necessarily him calling inspiration from all these other people, but it was just kind of...
It was the style at the time.
For sure. Yeah.
So, but we got a pair of tunes, one from Heavy Metal Maniac from 83, and then there'll be Rising of the Dead, which has a really cool like chant sing-along chorus, and then Destructor from Violence and Force, which was 1984. Destructor, yeah, spelled pretty interestingly. And then we'll end with a Razor tune, which we'll talk all about that when we get back. So enjoy Anvil with a pair, Mothra and March of the Crabs from their debut Metal on Metal, and then Rising of the Dead and Destructor from Exciter, followed by some Mystery Razor.
Destiny. The legend lives on, let it live. This is the rising of the dead. can't believe it after gas. But then it goes surrounding all the heat, screams and tunes. The time is coming, the time is now, creeps your new. Letting strikes to the last, stop the dreaded funeral. Running pressure, feels like we're above the trees and stone. Clouds from the underworld, destroy the human race. Unleash upon us, true nightmares, spreading all the grace. From the holy rise, screams, cries, and death. Oh, where up? Friend and rage, set the stage, the start to kill. Invaders, the deception in the night. Invaders, groups to say, fight and fight. Invaders, spreading out to take command. Invaders, feature mankind at hand. Related bodies now employed upon the streets. Restrictions now seeking out the human flesh to eat. Restrictions of the damned without today's face. And as the shoulder in the middle of all the nothing. Female both the stone wrists and tail close and tense. Spanish the population built up its defense. Sudden through the awakening as cities saw the dread. I'm rushing the slaughter, tell us how we kill the dead. From the holy life, screams, cries, and death. Oh, well, frantic rage to set the stage. Start to cow. Invaders, the deception in the night. Invaders, groups to say, fight and fight. Invaders, spreading out to take command. Invaders, feature mankind.
That was Evil Invaders from Razor. And before that, we had a pair from Exciter, Destructor, Rising of the Dead. And then we started with Mothra and March of the Crab from Anvil. So I guess we'll jump back to Exciter for a second and then kind of talk about the last tune you heard there, Razor. Anything else you kind of want to throw in, I guess, that you heard in terms of the we talked about the vocal influences, I guess, of Exciter and mentioned a little bit about the German vibe.
I mentioned the kind of unbridled guitar energy, I guess, similar to like Sirath Ungul, to where it's like the solos just don't end and they just kind of like blow out of nowhere,
Yeah. I mean, the album title itself, Heavy Metal Maniac, is like perfect for what these guys are,
Yeah.
I feel like first and foremost, the weirdest part about Canadian metal stuff, and we'll talk about this with when we get to like Pile Driver and stuff like that, is you said it before, the unbridled passion that these bands have towards metal. Like, they're like Manowar, but like minus the sort of cheesiness or something, or minus the irony,
and stuff. But I don't know if it has to do with like the Canadian record industry not necessarily being as I guess as like focused, and like if you're an American band on a big label, they kind of like cater you to, you've got to fit into this certain criteria for this type of band, be cohesive in your image and lyrics and, album covers and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't know if a lot of this stuff was just more seat of your pants kind of stuff, more underground, or just didn't have that kind of guiding hand, which I kind of enjoyed a lot more.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it has like a punk aesthetic to it, or a hardcore aesthetic, in that it is raw and rough around the edges, and maybe not well thought out, like you said.
Yeah.
I mean, the lyrics on a lot of these records are one could call them dumb, but I almost look at them as like spontaneous or something, like you said.
They're enthusiastic about whatever, a lot of these were done by young kids, so it's like whatever you're into at the time. You like comic books, you like horror movies, you like, STDs, whatever.
Like everyone's in STDs. But yeah, and Anthrax had a little bit of that too, that sort of joking quality to them. They wrote songs about Judge Dredd and just whatever they felt like, and maybe they took a little flack from like the Metallicas and Megadeths, and we're always writing more, I guess, serious, political or
Anthrax
social,
came out of the New York hardcore scene as well, which had the punk scene always had much more of a humorous slant on itself than metal always. I think that was one of the big things that turned a lot of people off, is that metal
took itself so seriously all the time. Yeah.
Which is fine for some bands, but not every. Especially when you're singing about zombies and stuff, it's pretty stupid.
Yeah. And we talked about that with the Death show last week. How I think Chuck had come to a point in his life where he's no longer
wanting to. Enough of this leprosy crap.
Yeah. And so I don't know. I guess take this stuff with a grain of salt as we kind of run through the gamut of the Canadian thrash stuff, because it is. It's just different, in terms of their lyrical natures and stuff. And even like misspelling Destructor, it's something you would see from the German metal scene, bands like Creator and Sodom, would do stuff like this, and of course Destruction. Yeah. And I hear bits of that, it's definitely a more blackened, raw kind of sound than what you would get from the Metallicas and Megadeths of this time.
I guess, they've almost got, it's like a fusion of the whole thrash energy and vibe, but then goes back to the new wave of British heavy metal. Like, look at Iron Maiden's first couple records, and there's stuff about Genghis Khan, and there's no kind of like through line for what the thing is about at all. So and because it had that sort of raw nature to it. Even the Priest records in the late 70s had more of a less slicked up quality. So they're drawing from kind of a cool influence in that. And then Razor, I guess speaking of punk production and raw, kind of nature. It's a rough sounding production. But.
Yeah, and Evil Invaders, which was their debut in 85, it's definitely, I hear on that song a lot of the proto-German thrash. The vibe I really get the most from Razor, though, I think maybe because of how raw the production is Sodom. They're the band that jumps out the most immediately to me. Because they don't have the technicality of Destruction, on some level.
Or even Creator.
Yeah, Creator, although we'll talk more about Creator when we talk about the evolution that the Razor kind of undergoes a little, but the solos kind of just like fly out from nowhere in a very Slayer kind of way. And Slayer obviously is like almost the house band of the American thrash influence of a lot of these Canadian bands, that were.
All these bands are almost they're more on the fringes of that kind of. What do you call it? The more satanic, the over the top. When we get to Pile Driver, we're talking about over the top is that's basically what they're about.
And you hear like a lot of the almost like the dive bomb kind of whammy solos that the Slayer guys would have played, and it's cool. It gives it definitely a more punk vibe, and
stuff I'd never heard back in the day. Like Slayer seemed like it was this this kind of unique entity and within the U.S. thrash, and then if I would have heard,
it's cool to know. Bands, it's cool to know that they had like kindred. Spirits, throughout North America and stuff. It's just, and I think one of the weird parts that we should talk about is like the access, because I don't think any of this stuff was like really readily accessible to the American market.
And and this is just a theory. I can't really back this up on anything, but
we were pontificating earlier.
I'm guessing that since a lot of the Canadian bands are actually on foreign labels, or else they're on like Razor. The first two Razor records were on Attic, the same label that screwed over Anvil.
Oh, okay.
And kind of never really pushed them or anything. But I'm guessing they were all kind of through the same distribution channel. So all the Canadian stuff got over to Germany and the UK and vice versa. But I don't think a lot of it migrated down to the States because there wasn't. Especially when it was that underground, there wasn't really those kind of deals to where we're going to import records. It was like the guys from Megaforce would license stuff. It was very kind of like limited. Or Metal Blade.
I think too that the thrash market wasn't in this period of time. We're talking between like 82 and like 86,
it didn't
87.
Break
it didn't really break till 86, really. When Masters came out and Rain and Blood and some of that stuff, and so there wouldn't have been a market for it. It was probably hard enough to get a hold of. Well, not hard, but it was probably like mystical enough to get a hold of, like Bonded by Blood and you know, those kind of records, just being an American thrash fan, let alone looking outside of America to find some of this kind of stuff. And I don't know if it was because, you know, maybe the German thrash metal scene had its act together a little bit better, so that at least Americans could have been exposed a little bit more to the German thrash,
because that stuff made it through, but I don't know what the penetration in the market was at all, you know.
But I feel like it was maybe a little bit more than some of the Canadian stuff, in a weird way, even though Canada's right there. You know?
The only one I'd ever heard of was Exciter, and I thought they were like a cock rock band.
Yeah,
I never put two and two together, and they're completely not that at all.
Yeah, so and so it's kind of weird. And so then the secondary theory that we were sort of, you know, bouncing around is, you know, if these were on import labels, maybe the Europeans who were consuming metal had just as much of a shot at getting a hold of some of this stuff as they did some of the American stuff. And so the influence of the Canadian metal scene was felt a little bit more in some of the, especially the northern European countries, you know, Scandinavia specifically, you know, because it seems as if there's a lot of Norwegian and Swedish bands that have sort of thrown ode to this kind of Canadian metal scene, probably because it is a little rougher around the edges. And so the death metal and black metal bands, you know, probably
bands like Infernal Majesty and Sacrifice and Slaughter.
Yeah,
you know,
they felt like kind of kindred spirit, you know, with all that, and
it was pushing the bar of extremity too, for, you know, visually and musically and whatever else, thematically.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, Pile Driver will be covered by Marduk, you know, or Marduk exclusively, and then you know, I mean, Dark Throne has written about. I mean, Fenriz kind of talks about some of this underground thrash stuff that he likes, and I'm sure this is right on his radar. You know, I mean, he wrote a song called Canadian Metal, is this kind of an ode, but yeah, for sure, you know, you pick up some of that stuff, especially that underground vibe from Razor. So, and Evil Invaders is a song that we were kind of familiar with too, and it never, I knew it was a cover when I reviewed the record years ago, and I don't think I really put two and two together where Razor was from or anything about that when I reviewed Hypocrisy's The Final Chapter, which has Evil Invaders as a cover song on there. And I knew it wasn't a Hypocrisy song. Like the first time I heard it, I was like, this is just too weird.
That riff sounds very much Hypocrisy-like.
It could be Attack Green riff, you know. But there was just something really almost too simple about the song, you know, the lyrics and different things like that. Even though, like,
even
he was obsessed with Alien.
Yeah, it
stuff,
totally works. You know, fits into his canon.
Yeah, but later on the record is a tune called Cutthroat, which is where we're going to kind of turn to next. And the opening riff, you know, we were kind of bouncing around, you know, what it sort of sounded like, and I kind of mentioned to Mark that it really reminded me of, you know, Fight Fire with Fire, Metallica mixed with like a Creator riff, and then you
something off like Flag of Hate, or like the really kind of like primitive, right as they're kind of like in their
kind of right before Terrible Certainty and stuff starts
when they
out.
really start to kind of explode.
Yeah, but and then there's a really cool sick scream at the end that's pretty awesome, you know, and really kind of shows you where the band was going to go. Yeah, we would have liked to have shown you a little bit more Razor, just like we would have liked to have shown you a lot more any of these bands, and they do merit, you know, kind of digging into some of their other albums.
And most of the stuff has either been reissued or, you know, available on more, you know, nefarious means, but you can definitely find the stuff.
For sure. And then we're going to turn to a band I'll let Mark talk a little bit about, because this is a
Pile Driver. Unfortunately, I just picked up Pile Driver's Metal Inquisition record
on vinyl,
but it's the 1985 HMV version that they actually omitted Sodomize the Dead and Sex with Satan.
They did. They changed the titles on the back.
And Alien Rape was Alien Raid instead. But basically,
censorship,
it was,
man. It's a
Pile Driver was basically two guys started. I think they've only really have two records out. Gord Pile Driver Kirchen is kind of the guy behind the whole thing. He's the vocalist, and then Leslie Howe did all the instrumentation. And this is one of the first metal records that I really know of that used exclusively programmed drums.
Oh yeah, the drum machine.
As far as everything about the band is retardedly over the top. I mean, the cover is like a guy in a bondage outfit, or it's a mix of
pile driving a guitar
into a guy.
Yeah. I mean, you can't get much more homoerotic than that, you know. And
if you're not a metalhead, you might as well be dead.
Yeah.
Death by guillotine.
Yes. And then he's wearing that on his jacket on the back of the vinyl, which is cool. So, and of course, these guys got put on the map for Mark and I when, of course, as we mentioned before, you know, Marduk covered two songs. Did they cover Sodomize the Dead?
Sodomize the Dead and Sex with Satan.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was a big deal to be covered by a cult black metal band like Marduk, back in the day.
And when I just heard the name Pile Driver, I was, all I think of is Heavy Machinery. I didn't think of, anything tough.
Or something from like Transformers or something like that, a character. But it's a cool song. I mean, it's the same lyric over and over and over again.
I think at the very end they might scream Pile Driver. But.
Yeah. I always got like a Venom Motorhead vibe from them, with a little bit of Slayerisms kind of thrown in for good. Well,
I think there's a lot of Dee Snider, kind of Twisted Sister, ethics to the whole thing.
And Alice Cooper as well. The sort of shock rock kind of value. Halloween music or something.
It's some fat dude from Canada, so I don't think they really went too far outside of just these small little circles. And again, just looking at them, I would have always expected they were German.
Yeah,
given their aesthetics and their lyrical content and stuff.
And that's another thing we were talking about in terms of why does some of the Northern European scene pick up on some of the Canadian bands so much? I mean, it could be the language barrier that maybe they don't see so obviously how horrible some of these lyrics are and ridiculous. I've told Marco's story when I was traveling through Germany. I got picked up by some of my friends who were from Halle, which is a northern German city up by Dresden, and they were rocking out like Blind Guardian in the car because they knew I liked power metal and stuff. And then they threw in a Manowar tape, and they were just like, "Isn't this awesome?" No. And I'm like, "No, it's really, really bad." I'm like, "Do you understand how bad the lyrics are?" And they're like, "Well, kind of." And I'm like, I think if you really like lived in the English language, you would know just how horrible these lyrics are, So I think there's something to be said about language barrier sometimes, I mean,
it's certain charm to a lot of it,
Yeah, I mean, there's probably songs that you and I have listened to that were sung in Norwegian that are probably, absolutely retarded, we just didn't know it, But, and then we're gonna kind of close things out with a double dose of two I guess more extreme leaning bands, definitely draped in Slayer, which is Sacrifice and Slaughter. And I guess we'll introduce Sacrifice and then just pretty much talk about Slaughter when we get back. But they do have an Anvil-esque vibe that's mixed in with the sort of Slayer stuff. A lot dirtier. Mark and I both picked up on pay attention to some of the bass stuff that's going on.
There's a lot of like Gene Simmons like bass slides and stuff going on too,
and even like early primitive like stuff that like DiGiorgio or somebody will do.
Yeah, and that's something only on a couple, maybe the third time I listened to it that I really pick up on the bass stuff. But
and so there's some progisms too, but definitely like a Hell Awaits era Slayer kind of feel.
Like if it was Slayer, but recorded at by a Bay Area artist that wasn't quite as talented.
Yeah. So Sacrifice, very cool. This is a band I've recently discovered. I've had the Slaughter CD, which we'll talk more about later. And this is not the Mark Slaughter, Dana Strum Slaughter, which has its own value. Not really, actually.
To some it does.
In 6th grade it did.
Slow dancing.
Yeah. Fly to the Angels, baby. But and then we'll kind of get into their famous record Strapato when we get back. But we've got Razor Cutthroat on the way, followed by Pile Driver, Sodomize the Dead, and then a pair from Sacrifice. This one's For Determination, Terror Strikes, and Cyanide. And then a pair from Slaughter as well. But we'll talk to you more about those when we get back.
Swiss worship and separate disciples of men. The record is telling the stones of God, but they follow the disposal of them. Cast out imprisonment, thrash and agony. Out counts on butcher, and seizes slavery. Cutthroat. fucking list. Better gonna leave you, tell me you will die. Your religion, I want them keeping you alive.
That was Tortured Souls and Disintegration Incinerator from Slaughter's Strapato record. And then before that, you heard Cyanide, and we started with Forward Determination Terror Strikes from the pair from Sacrifice. And then the aforementioned Pile Driver, Sodomize the Dead, and Razor Cutthroat. So
you don't need to say much more about this.
No, they kind of speak for themselves. But one thing I wanted to mention about the Cyanide tune, there's some really cool, in terms of vocally, it's like a mix between Chuck Billy and Tom Araya on some of that Sacrifice stuff. And both those records, Slaughter and Sacrifice, were both put out in 87, so they were kind of right on the cusp, right as Rain and Blood came out in late 86, so this is really kind of when thrash is starting to move in a more extreme sort of direction. Yeah. And I mean, the German scene was already there. I mean, the German scene was almost already proto-death metal kind of stuff, but for sure Sacrifice are hinting towards it, and Slaughter are almost like right there. I mean, they're almost kind of death metal-y thrash.
Yeah, even stuff. More so. I mean, because you had Possessed doing their thing, but then these guys almost have it's like the weird meshing of hardcore punk of. I mean, you're starting to hear even the guitar tone is very reminiscent of the early Swedish death metal sound.
Sure, yeah.
And just like, the really obvious Celtic Frost stuff happened. It's just this weird mishmash.
Yeah.
But that kind of like somehow really just came together really cohesively and well. And
yeah.
It's probably one of the favorite things that we've listened to on the show.
Yeah, these two records in particular, and the Slaughter I've had for a while. I kind of got a hold of this and Infernal Majesty, which will probably be making an appearance on one of these shows, Canadian metal shows, rumor has it. But they're kind of doing their own different thing. I don't want to get into that, but I think I bought those at the same time because I grabbed them online and liked them, and so I bought the records. But the Sacrifice thing is more recent, and that's more rooted in the thrash stuff, especially in Forward Determination, Terror Strikes as a kind of Metallica breakdown. But even in terms of like I think you and I were talking on that tune Cyanide, their composition sense is very like Creator Destruction. It doesn't mean they sound like them, but the way that the choices they make musically in terms of how they,
all these almost like atonal riffs and stuff.
Well, and how he'll like stop and it'll like kind of just be like him like singing, screaming. It's kind of something like Millet did like a lot or something.
There's a lot of well, I can hear where a band like Autopsy would have pulled stuff out, or even a band like Slaughter might have got something out of Siege, or that type of hardcore, especially vocal delivery.
Yeah, and that's one of the things when we moved to Slaughter Strapato, I mean, you mentioned Siege, and I mentioned that opening riff on, I think it was on Tortured Souls, really reminded me of Repulsion, like a
Oh, yeah.
it's like Venom and Celtic Frost mixed with like a really crusty Repulsion kind of thing, which is cool. I mean, Repulsion was coming out that same time.
Well, we didn't mention the Chuck Schuldiner
the Chuck
from
connection.
Death.
Yeah, I think that was the other thing that made me want to grab a hold of Slaughter. A couple of years ago was I knew this connection that he had joined.
Well,
the
even
band.
It's like what is it? Track 2, "Fuck of Death."
Yeah, FOD.
Yeah, which is what is it? Is basically just referring to the short time that Chuck was in the band.
Oh, is that what it was about? Oh, that's cool.
Well, that's what Metal Archive said.
Did they say? That's cool. Yeah, but. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think Death was on hiatus, and so he moved up to play with Slaughter for a while. And
it was like 6 months, and he hated Canada or something.
Chuck's, he's from Florida,
I think these guys
he's a testy guy. They're most of these bands that we've been listening to are Ontario, Toronto based, right?
Yeah, I didn't write.
I'm almost positive these guys are from Toronto.
Yeah, Toronto, Ontario.
And so that kind of adds like a different element that you got this death metal guy coming up to play in your band. I'm sure that kind of
Slaughter was basically death metal as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I mean, it's all Celtic Frost and Venom riffs, sort of sprinkled in with, like you said, the hardcore stuff. Especially the drumming has some very much a punk hardcore kind of grind crust beat to it. And even like. But again, there's still that sheen of Canadian cheese, like in the Incinerator. Incinerator! Like it's
Do you have any idea what the title of the album is?
I think I looked it up at one point, but it escapes me at the moment. I apologize. I don't know.
It's probably like a missile.
Yeah, it's probably something cool. But at the end of Tortured Souls and at the end of Incinerator, there's some cool breakdowns. I mean, they definitely know how to throw a good, thrashy breakdown in the midst of a kind of death metal song, so... But, none of these won the grandiose title of being the crown champion or the gem of the Canadian metal scene in the 80s.
Well, we're going to bookend the show, I think.
Well, you'll if you're clever, you'll pick up some hints near the end here. But we hope you enjoyed what we did. It was kind of fun just to sort of give a little sampling, kind of a mixtape of Canadian metal is really kind of what we were trying to approach.
Well, I'm sure we missed a lot of stuff, but I would love, give us a jingle on either our Facebook page or requiempodcast@gmail.com would be fantastic.
Yep, and check us out on iTunes, and leave some comments and different things like that. And I guess do wait maybe to freak out on us until you hear the second show, because we do have other bands lined up for the second kind of mixtape Canadian, that were in the 80s and different things. So maybe we're not as bumbling of idiots as you might assume.
But we're new to it.
Yeah, we are new to it. We're definitely virgins to Canadian metal. But we wanted to end on a high note, literally. And I was telling Mark that if you could play a song at my funeral, this would be it. And we're kind of going full circle back to 2007 and back to the the Anvil This Is 13 record. And I think they actually show them really focusing on this song specifically in the movie. And
they're working on
he's working on the solo and stuff like that. Yeah, and I remember mowing the lawn to this song a lot a couple summers ago, because this was a good mowing lawn record. But Flying Blind, and it's a great tune. I love the solo. It has a Ace Frehley kind of vibe where he's really just sort of
it's like a 4 notes solo, but it's perfect.
It's cool, and it's definitely epic. Don't pay too much attention to the lyrics because they're pretty awful. But that's kind of
when you're flying and you just can't see. You can't see what is happening
to me or something. Flying blind. I mean,
whatever you think the lyrics are, that's probably what they are.
Exactly. So, but shoot us a line. Let us know what you thought. And like you said, Mark said, check us out on Facebook. Check us out at our requiempodcast@gmail.com or on the website. So for Anvil, Flying Blind, and Canadian Metal Part 1, I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark.
When you are lost and you can't find your way.